In this lecture, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it is made up of sensory and motor neurons that are monitoring the internal environment for the sensory neurons, and for the autonomic motor neurons, they're controlling your viscera, your involuntary muscle, smooth muscle, which is in most of your visceral organs, digestive tract, for example, urinary tract, and also glands are controlled by those motor neurons. So if we look down here you see the targets of autonomic motor neurons. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on the motor neurons. We will talk about the autonomic sensory neurons in another lecture, but here we're going to focus on the motor neurons. Just to review before we talk more about those, the somatic nervous system is made up of your somatic motor neurons, and those are the ones we studied in our last unit, the ones that go to your skeletal muscles. So those are referred to as somatic motor neurons, and they produce controlled, conscious, voluntary movements for the most part. There's also somatic sensory neurons that monitor our external environment. We'll also be talking about those in a later lecture, especially focusing on the eye, ear, taste, touch receptors. So, autonomic nervous system. One of the ways we're going to study it is by comparing it to the somatic nervous system. So in this picture, there's some information that we've covered in the past, so let's go over it. Here we see a somatic motor neuron cell body in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So this is something we talked about earlier. And their axons, the somatic motor neuron axons, leave the ventral horn and they leave the spinal cord through the ventral root, which only has motor axons in it. Hence we say it's pure motor. And then it travels along various spinal nerves to skeletal muscle, which we call the effector, or also sometimes it's referred to as the target. Or another way to say it is that these somatic motor neurons synapse with the skeletal muscle. And you remember, I hope, this neuromuscular junction here. We spent quite a bit of time on that, where when the action potential comes down, it releases acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, which binds to the muscle cell, triggers a muscle action potential, and through a series of steps leads to calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the muscle and contraction. So this is all review from things we've studied in the past. So notice that to get from the spinal cord all the way to the muscle, it takes sets of a single neuron its axon can extend all the way to the muscle. Okay, now compare that with autonomic motor neurons. Let's start with the top picture up here. So we're looking at this one right now. Notice, if you look closely, that to get to the targets, the effectors, the cardiac muscle, if you're talking about heart or smooth muscle, the bladder, or various glands, to get there it takes two motor neurons, two of them. So the first one is in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and again its axons also leave through the ventral root, but notice they don't get all the way to the effector, the target organ. They only get part of the way there, and then they synapse with a second neuron whose cell body is out in the peripheral nervous system. And if you recall, congregations of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are referred to as ganglia, ganglion is the singular. And because this contains autonomic motor neurons, this is an autonomic ganglion. And then the axon of that neuron is going to extend to the target or effectors and synapse with it. So it takes two neurons, and they refer to the first one as the preganglionic and the second one as the postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic because the axon is coming up to the ganglion. Postganglionic because the axon is leaving the ganglion, going to the effector. Okay, so there is an exception in the middle here that we'll get to in a moment, but for now let's focus on the fact that in most cases it takes two autonomic motor neurons to get to the target. Okay, and notice that they're also labeling this sympathetic. And if we look down here at the bottom at this other example where you also have two motor neurons going to the target called the preganglionic and the postganglionic, just like above, but these are called parasympathetic. So what's the difference? They're both autonomic motor neurons. They both go to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So the difference primarily is in the effect they have on their target. So many, not all, but many of your organs receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. In other words, both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons go to and synapse with the same effector. And in those cases, the sympathetic and parasympathetic have opposite effects on their target. So I like to think of it somewhat like the gas and brake pedal in a car. To really control an organ, muscles, or glands, it's helpful if you can both speed them up and slow them down. Or if it's a gland, if you can increase secretion or inhibit it. So in most cases, that's what's going on with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. You're going to have both types of neurons going to the same organ having opposite effects. So for example, you have sympathetic fibers, axons going to your heart, and when you send action potentials down them, your heart beats faster. It increases your heart rate. You also have parasympathetic motor neurons going to your heart, and when that sends action potentials to your heart rate slows down. So they have opposite effects on the heart. Now, as we'll see a little later when we go over some other examples, you can't generalize and say that the sympathetic division always speeds up or increases, stimulates the organ, and the parasympathetic inhibits it or slows things down. It's not that simple. So we'll see that the reverse is also true in some cases, where the parasympathetic stimulates and the sympathetic inhibits, as with digestion. Okay, but the main point is that they have opposite effects on their target. How can that be? Because as we learned when we studied action potentials, an action potential is an action potential. It's not any different if it's traveling down a sensory or an interneuron or a motor neuron. It's always the same intensity. So it isn't that that's the difference, the action potential. What's one of the main differences is in what kind of neurotransmitter is released from the neuron. So this is something you're going to need to know, so let's look at that. If we're keeping track of what neurotransmitters are released, we have to look at two different synapses for both divisions. For the sympathetic, there's this synapse where the preganglionic and the postganglionic are synapsing, and we see that the neurotransmitter is good old familiar acetylcholine. Okay, then when we look at the next synapse between the postganglionic sympathetic motor neuron and the target organ, we see it's a different neurotransmitter. NE is for norepinephrine or noradrenaline. So noradrenaline is going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft, just like you learned with skeletal muscle, bind to receptors on the target, just like acetylcholine did with skeletal muscle. And when it does, it's going to have its effect on the target. Now let's look down here at the parasympathetic division. What's the neurotransmitter at this first synapse here? It's acetylcholine. Okay, and then at the second synapse, it's also acetylcholine. So this goes part of the way anyway in explaining how the sympathetic and parasympathetic can have different effects on the same organ, because they're releasing different neurotransmitters, norepinephrine for sympathetic, acetylcholine for parasympathetic, and those are binding to different receptors, acetylcholine or norepinephrine receptors. And so they're going to have different effects. Okay, so there's a couple other things to notice in this picture. For the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are myelinated. They have a myelin sheath, but the postganglionic are not myelinated. And then I also wanted to mention this middle section, this middle example. This is an exception to the having two cells, requiring two autonomic motor neurons to reach the target. In the case of the adrenal medulla, which makes the hormone adrenaline, you'll study it in 213. But in here in the middle, this is the medulla, there are cells in here that produce epinephrine or adrenaline, and also its cousin noradrenaline or norepinephrine. So those are made by these cells in here. They are secreted into the bloodstream, so they are considered to be hormones. So notice in this case the norepinephrine released from the adrenal medulla is considered a hormone traveling through the blood, but up here when it's released from a neuron, we refer to it as a neurotransmitter. Whether it's released in the blood or at a synapse, it's going to have similar effects on its targets. So the stimulus to release these hormones by the adrenal medulla is by a preganglionic sympathetic neuron. So it will send action potentials to it, and then the medulla will release those neurotransmitters, or as they're referred to as hormones. So there is no postganglionic motor neuron going to the adrenal medulla. Instead, it's more like the medulla cells themselves are a modified postganglionic sympathetic cells. They're releasing a similar chemical, norepinephrine. So that's an exception. And another thing about the adrenal medulla is that it has no parasympathetic neurons going to it. So it's the adrenal medulla is an example of an organ or gland that is not controlled by both. It's the sympathetic. You want to increase release of these hormones, you send sympathetic impulses, but you don't inhibit it with the parasympathetic. Okay, so this complicated looking picture shows a couple things I want to cover. First, let's talk about the location of the sympathetic. We're talking about the sympathetic division right now. The location of the neurons that make up the sympathetic division. So we're not going to go into great detail about this, but I do want you to know where the neuron cell bodies are for the pre- and the postganglionic motor neurons for the sympathetic. So we're not going to trace the axons, although I will show you a picture of it, but you do need to know where the cell bodies are. So the sympathetic division, the cell bodies are in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, lateral horn, but notice they're not throughout the entire length of the spinal cord. They are in the thoracic and lumbar parts of the spinal cord, not in the sacral or the cervical parts. And because of that, they sometimes refer to the sympathetic division as the thoracolumbar division. Thoracolumbar, because it's in the thoracic and lumbar region. So that's where their cell bodies are. And then the postganglionic cell bodies are in ganglia, and their ganglia are called, most of the ganglia they're in anyway, run along the side of your spinal cord, on either side of it, as a chain of ganglia. Like each little bead-like structure here is a ganglion. So they call it the sympathetic chain ganglia or sympathetic trunk ganglia. So most of them are there. There's some in some other ganglia in front of your spinal cord, the prevertebral ganglion, but most are in these sympathetic trunk ganglia. And then their axons have to be pretty long because they're going to go all the way to the targets, which you see over here. You've got some in the head, the heart, lungs. We'll go over those later. But now we're just looking at the location. So thoracolumbar division. This is what we're not going to be going into detail, but I did want to show you anyway, is that if you follow the path of the axons, you see it gets a little messy here. But I did want to mention that the axons, when they leave the ventral root and enter the spinal cord, then they're going to pass through these rami communicantes. You might remember those from when we talked about the spinal cord. Rami, to remind you, are branches of the spinal cord. So the rami, those rami communicans contain axons of sympathetic neurons. Okay, but once again, I'm not going to be asking you to trace the axon pathway, only where the cell bodies are. For the parasympathetic division, it's quite different. Notice they're way up here in the brain, not even in the spinal cord, but in the brain, and then way down in the sacral part of the spinal cord in the lateral horn. So, this division they sometimes call the craniosacral. Cranial for head, sacral for the inferior part of the spinal cord. So that's where the preganglionic cell bodies are for the parasympathetic. And then their axons are quite long. They're going to run with some of your spinal nerve, or they form what are called the splanchnic nerves, or they may run with some of the cranial nerves, like cranial nerve number 9 or 10, to get to the targets. And the postganglionic cell bodies are hard to see. Maybe the best one you can see is in the stomach. So if you look really closely, you see this, a little red ball here. That's where the ganglia is for the postganglionic neuron cell bodies. And so they're almost at the target, and therefore they refer to them as terminal ganglia. Terminal, because they're almost at the terminus. So their axons are quite short because they don't have far to go. So that's, a difference you see. If you remember, the sympathetic, the postganglionic cell bodies were over here in these chain ganglia. So they're quite far from their target. Okay, so that's the location of these. And just to once again mention that one of the main ways that the sympathetic and parasympathetic could have different effects on their targets is that they're releasing different neurotransmitters. So norepinephrine for the sympathetic, acetylcholine for the parasympathetic. Okay, and then there's also different types of receptors for acetylcholine. So they have different names: muscarinic, nicotinic receptors. These are both acetylcholine receptors, but they're different receptors, so they can have different effects on the target cell. So that helps explain how acetylcholine can, in some cases, slow down an organ, and in other cases speed up an organ. So for example, when acetylcholine binds to your heart, it slows down your heart rate. But for your digestive system, it stimulates gland secretion and muscle contraction, because the parasympathetic division stimulates digestion. So it's really a combination of what's the neurotransmitter released and what exactly is the type of neurotransmitter for that neurotransmitter. What kind of receptor is it? Okay, now if you look on your objective sheet, there is a list of organs that I will be asking you about, what effect the sympathetic and the parasympathetic have on it. So we will go over that. But I think one of the easiest ways to remember this, if you're not actually looking it up but just trying to remember it off the top of your head, what is the sympathetic, what effect does it have versus the parasympathetic? I think the easiest way, because this is going to be familiar to you, is to talk about what happens when you're in an emergency. When you're in an extreme physical or psychological stressful situation, you send sympathetic action. You send action potentials down all your sympathetic motor neurons. It's like a mass activation of your sympathetic nervous system. So you're just flooding your body with action potentials going down all of these axons to all these different targets, your digestive tract, your muscles, and your heart, and your lungs, and so on. Okay, and we call that the fight or flight response. So the fight or flight response is mediated by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. It's the sympathetic fibers that are bringing it about. And so what effects does it have? Well, just think about when you've been in a fight or flight situation, which we've all been in, either real or imagined. You know, if you're frightened, you're scared, or you're in a dangerous situation, there's at least some of these things that are listed here you're aware of. For example, your heart rate's going to increase, so your heart's going to start pounding. Your breathing rate is going to go up, and you're also going to dilate your airways. You're going to bring more air into your lungs. Why? Because you want more oxygen for increased cellular respiration, so you can make more ATP. This is probably not something you may notice, but your pupils tend to dilate. We haven't talked about the eye yet, but your pupil is a ring of smooth muscle. Your iris, rather, has a ring of smooth muscle around a hole called the pupil. And you can make the pupil bigger to let more light in. So the sympathetic division causes pupil dilation, but it's not increasing everything. It does inhibit blood flow to a lot of your visceral organs, like your digestive system is inhibited by the fight or flight response, and so is the urinary system. Which makes sense if you think about it. If you're in an emergency, you don't really want to be worrying about digesting your lunch or removing waste products from your kidney as much as you want to worry about getting lots of glucose and ATP to your muscles and moving your blood around quickly. So you're going to increase blood flow to your heart, your skeletal muscles, your adipose tissue. You're going to break down stored glucose. So you'll release it, for example, from your liver and from your adipose tissue. And something else not listed here, but that happens, is that you, especially in an extreme fight or flight response, you most likely release adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine from your adrenal medulla, because adrenaline, while it's a hormone and not part of the sympathetic nervous system, it does have the same effect on your organs, and so it's really an enhancement of the fight or flight response. It's part of it, and it enhances it, and the adrenaline actually lasts longer released as a hormone moving through your bloodstream than as a neurotransmitter, synapse, so it helps prolong your fight or flight response. So adrenaline release is another function. So just think about all the things that happen when you're in fight or flight mode, and that'll help you in most cases figure out what effect the sympathetic nervous system has. Now the parasympathetic, we don't usually think about being in a state of mass parasympathetic activation like we do with these fight or flight response, but there are some examples of where you're mostly sending parasympathetic impulses to your body, and I would give as one example I can think of is if you eat a huge meal, say like a huge feast where you just gorge yourself with so much food, and you know that feeling afterwards. You just want to sit on the couch and not move. And that's kind of what it's like to be in a state of parasympathetic arousal, where you're mainly sending parasympathetic fibers, or not fibers, action potentials to your cells, to the parasympathetic targets. So the parasympathetic is sometimes called the resting and digesting division because it promotes digestion, the production of saliva, digestion. That includes both stimulating muscle contraction along the digestive tract to help mechanically digest your food and to move it along, and also gland secretion to, for example, make digestive enzymes to help you break down your food. So the parasympathetic stimulates digestion and also the urinary system, which kind of goes along with digestion. If you're eating and drinking a lot, you're also going to have to process that. You're going to have to remove not just waste products from your blood, but also excess water and electrolytes. So the urinary system is also activated. It also stimulates tear production. Okay, and then it decreases your heart rate, your breathing rate. It constricts your airways, or it doesn't dilate them, and your pupils constrict. So these are all effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, usually we are not flooding our body with sympathetic or parasympathetic impulses. Those are in more unusual circumstances. Danger, eating a huge meal and not being in danger. But most of the time you're using your parasympathetic and your sympathetic kind of in a back and forth manner to maintain homeostasis. So going back to my car analogy, where they're like the brake and the gas pedal, it's like driving around town in your car. You got to use the gas and then the brake and then the gas and then the brake. It's usually more along those lines, where you're using both to maintain homeostasis. So if you're sitting down and resting, you might be sending out more parasympathetic impulses. But then if you jump up and start exercising, then you're going to increase sympathetic innervation. And then when you relax again, the parasympathetic will help bring your heart rate back down, and so on. So usually they're working in conjunction to maintain homeostasis. Okay, and going back to this picture just to review some of these organs again that you need to know. So again, look at your objective sheet, and it'll list the organs that I might ask about. So this is just showing sympathetic. So wherever you have these blue dotted lines going, that organ is innervated. So you can see the sympathetic, going to your heart and your lungs and a lot of those organs that we were just talking about. The digestive system, it's inhibitory for that, inhibitory for the urinary system. And then the same for the parasympathetic. It has many of the same organs shown. But again, notice not all, like look at this adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney. You don't see any pink line going over to it because it does not have parasympathetic innervation. So, in summary, many organs are controlled by both, and in those cases they tend to have opposite effects on that organ. But then there are some glands or muscles that are only controlled by one or the other. So, for example, your sweat glands are only controlled by the sympathetic. If you increase sympathetic impulses to your sweat glands, you'll make more sweat to cool your body down. Also, most of your blood vessels, the smooth muscle in the wall of them that controls the diameter of them and thus your blood pressure, is mainly controlled by sympathetic in the body. Although it's hard to generalize and say that the sympathetic always makes the blood vessel, constricts it or dilates it, because it's different in different organs. So we won't be going into that at this point yet. But in general, blood vessels are controlled by sympathetic. They've also, and the adrenal medulla I mentioned. And then they've also shown that the sympathetic appears to stimulate beta wave activity in the brain, which, if you think about it, makes sense since it's a fight or flight branch of the nervous system. And beta waves are associated with being focused and concentrating, which is something you want to do if you're in a fight or flight mode. So that's the introduction to the autonomic nervous system.